Sweet. Welcome. All right. I think we will get rolling. Maybe we'll have a few folks joining us. Thank you all for coming. Everybody was here last week, yeah? Okay, great. Nice to see you all again. Thanks for coming back. All right, I think so for today, as you know, we're going to be kind of combining what we did in week 1 and week 2. So we're going to be using some of our SQL knowledge, some of our Python knowledge, and applying it to a little bit more of a like mock project. So going through more of a data analysis process. So hopefully this one will be fun. So be very hands-on, maybe a little bit more so even than the last couple. So hopefully you get some good practice. Yeah, so a little bit more of like a lab type of format today. Maybe to get us started, could you all just give me one more quick refresher on your names and one thing, anything you remember from week 1 or 2? Maybe we'll start right here.
My name is Mansi, and I think in week 1 was probably a very good chance for me since I'm really good at SQL.
Okay.
And I now finally understand the basic concept of it.
Okay, excellent. Very good. Thanks for coming back, Mansi. Over here.
And one thing that I remember from week 1 is you need to choose, I forgot the name, if it's like the database or the workspace or something like that to make sure that it's clear.
Yes, your data source. Yes, very good. That's a good bit to remember. Very good, very specific. I like that. Thanks, Allie.
Yeah, it's that you need to figure out what kind of problem, like to specifically set up the problem that you need to solve, and then put those like function of the data together, like such as the order the data, and yeah.
Great. Yeah, getting super specific on your question. Perfect. All right. Thank you, Catherine. Okay, very good. Glad we got some stuff. So I think, so what we're going to do for the first part of this is kind of reinforce, review, refresher on our SQL content, on our Python content, make sure we're like ready to go. And then a lot of this is going to be kind of putting it into action today. All right. So very similar to last time, we're still using our same tool Hex. So go ahead and pop that back open. There's a new week 3 thing in there, which we'll get to in a little bit. All right, you've all used text before, so I'm going to skip that. Great. Okay, so just a super quick refresher on our SQL query structure. All right, we've got our select statement, which can look like this, but all we really need to write our basic statement is our select and our from. Anything else we can add based on our specific question and specifically what we need. So we might add a join if we're bringing in another table. We might add a where if we've got some filters or conditions going on. We might need to group by if we're going to summarize. We might need to order by if we need to sort. And we might want to limit if we say only want our top 5 or top 10 type of results, right? So these are going to be all your keywords. We're going to be writing a bunch of SQL queries later. We're going to be writing a little bit of Python later. So we just want to make sure we're all fresh, top of mind. All right. Awesome. Thank you for joining us. Remind me if you were here for either of the previous 2 sessions, just last week. Okay, sweet. Great. Thanks for coming back. All right, cool. So just another quick refresher on our queries. When we add our SQL cell, the very first thing you're going to want to do is run a quick select star from, get to know your table, select count star. These are all kind of our get to know our query or get to know our data type of queries. Remember that you're going to need to run your cell. So today, more so than the last couple of weeks, we're going to be writing a bunch of cells and kind of rerunning them, stacking a bunch of our cells together. So using a little bit more of kind of our data flow functionality. So you're going to need to be staying on top of that. We'll talk more about that once we get rolling. All right, quick refresher on joining data. All right, so if we have 2 data sets that have columns with our same value, we can join on that column or columns. Okay, so quick reminder of how this worked in our previous session. We had 2 data sets. We had our episode ratings data set, which had season and episode numbers. And then we had episode transcripts, okay, that had a line for every piece of dialogue in every episode. So we did two sort of things here in order to join them. First thing we did was just make sure that they have the same sort of rows and with an overlapping column. So we basically summarized our transcript data by episode so that we had one row in this data set for each episode to match this data set, which already had one row per episode. Okay. Once we had one row per episode in each, then we could do this part here, which is our join, which is typically for you all, you're pretty much always going to want to do a left join. And then here we just do our overlapping columns. Okay, so left join our other table using, in other cases, could be one column. In our case, it's two because we're looking at season and episode number. Okay. So if we're joining, we need overlapping columns. We're going to practice this in our project today. Okay. All right. Starting off with a little SQL refresher, we'll do a little Python refresher, and then we'll get into our project. So just doing a little warm up here. Okay. Little refresher on Python from last week. Okay, so Python, we're going to be interacting with data frames, remember. So data frames in Hex, thankfully, are just about the same as the SQL table. So you can do some stuff with your data frame in Python. You're going to create your data frames typically in Python. You can interact with them with SQL or with Python or both, which is great. We can switch back and forth. And also at any point, you can export to Excel and continue on there as well. Okay. So as a reminder to do our Python cell, this is our other kind of main type of cell in our document. And typically the first Python stuff you want to run is just looking at your data frame by column or perhaps by row. Okay, so any column in your data frame, you're just going to do square brackets and quotes to get your the name of your column in there and see what is in your data. Similar for your row, you're going to use iloc, which is our command for location, and then bracket 0 will just, or bracket whatever number gets you a row of your data so you can take a look at what's in there. Okay. All right, a couple other quick reminders on data frames. Okay, like we talked about last week, you can create a new column in any of your data frames, and this is what's really great for Python. When you're writing a SQL statement, if you're adding columns, it's going to create a new data frame. It's going to copy it and then have a new name with the additional columns. With Python, you can actually just add columns to your same data frame. Depending on what you're doing, that might be easier. So for example, we can have a new column where we're perhaps operating on two of our other columns. Maybe we're doing a percentage, maybe we're doing a total, something like that. And we can save that information. So our data set and then our square brackets, any new column name you want, and then our equal sign, that's what's going to save anything on the right-hand side to our new column. Okay, so this is how we're going to kind of be manipulating. This is one of the most common ways you're interacting with your data frames with Python. Anything you write like this, you could also write in SQL. We'll have some parts today where I'll give you the option of either writing something out in Python or in SQL, or you can try both, right? You can do it both times and make sure it gets you the same result. Okay, so if there's one you're more comfortable with or when you want to practice more, kind of up to you today. We'll see that when we get into our activity, all right? All right, and then just a reminder, we'll be using this a bunch today, our data browser in Hex. So once you're in there on our left-hand side, you'll have all your data frames that you're creating as we go. Today, we're going to have more data frames that we create as we work through the steps of our project. So as you're manipulating things, creating more frames, adding columns, you can always come and check in your data browser and make sure that your columns are coming out in the right place, you're referring to the right data frame, etc. Okay. All right, so fast refresh. All right, I'm going to have you go and open up our week 3 project. So go ahead and hop into Hex. I think it's just app.hex.tech. If you already got a login, or that link on the board will get you to the same place as well. Go to projects, look for our week 3, say week 3, and then template. You want to hit your ... and then duplicate to make your own copy. And then we're going to start working through that. Okay. All right. So our setup for today is a little bit different than our past 2 weeks. So what this is going to look like is you've got a bunch of instructions in here. Okay, so this is going to be formatted a little bit more like a lab type of project. So you'll see something like this when you open it up. You're going to see a bunch of text cells. Okay, what you're going to do throughout our session today, we'll kind of like walk through this together, is I've got instructions in here, and you're actually going to come in and work on your code in here, or maybe even add some cells in between sort of at each step. Okay, so this is, you can think of this as your outline, your framework for walking us through this project for today. Okay, make sure you get your copy. But here's what we're going to be doing for today's session. So we are going to be doing sort of a basic marketing analytics project. Okay, so the concept here, this is a fictionalized sort of version of a real analysis that I've done in the past. Okay, so you are a marketing intern at a retailer who's launching a line of waterproof shoes. Okay, your goal is to do some analysis to understand the performance of our marketing campaign. Okay, we're doing some marketing through a few different channels. And then we're going to use that analysis to make a recommendation at the end. So to understand how to allocate our budget between our different marketing channels. Okay, so that's sort of our outline for today. So I'm going to give you two data sets. So there's two data sets sort of loaded in here. The first one is our marketing spend data. So this is telling us how much money we spent on each of these, Facebook ads, Google ads, et cetera. Influencers and podcasting, I think, are our categories. And where. And then our other data set is going to tell us how much web traffic was driven to our landing page, our website, from each of those channels, and then also how much sort of total volume of purchases came from each of those channels. Okay, so of the people who landed on the website, how much money did they end up spending on our waterproof shoes? All right, and that's what we're going to be using to figure out what are our top performing marketing channels, start to think about a couple different metrics, ROI metrics that we can look at to understand, is our marketing spend effective? Do we want to keep spending there? How do we want to target our spend? Okay, outline of the project. Any questions about sort of outline of the project we're going to be doing? All right, great. Okay, so just as a general kind of outline, this is what we're going to be doing. And this is typically what you're going to be doing when you start a HEX project yourself. Excuse me. When you start a HEX project or any data analysis project. Okay, so you're always going to need to load your data. So get your data from somewhere. Maybe it's a database, maybe it's a file. In this case, I've given you a couple files that are going to be loaded in here. Then we're going to do these middle steps are sort of to model your data. So that's where we're going to be doing a lot of our SQL queries. This is going to be a strong continuation of what we talked about in week 1, if you were here for that piece. All right, so we're using SQL to get our data into a state where we can do our final analysis, get our piece of information out of it. As we do that, there's typically some cleaning up of our data that we need to do. For example, when we need to join our tables together, we need to make sure that we have a column that's overlapping data, right? So if it's a date or a number, it needs to be spelled the same, or otherwise using sort of the same conventions so that we can join on that. Okay. And then lastly, we're going to summarize and analyze our data. Once you've done all these steps, well, this is actually kind of the easiest part, but this is where you're going to actually do some of your, maybe your formulas, your calculations, and kind of come up with result. Okay. So I'm going to make suggestions as we go through of whether to do these steps in SQL or Python. Like I said, I think everything in this project can be done in either, so kind of up to you on what you want to try. Okay. All right, so the very first thing we're going to do is to come down to your first code cell here. I've written part of it for you, and you're going to write the other line that we need here, okay? So this part doesn't need to be done in Python. This is importing our data. So if you look in your kind of HEX browser on the left-hand side, you'll see a few different kind of tools here. We've mostly been using data browser, right? This is where we see our data frames. You're going to go to files, which I don't know that we looked at in previous weeks, and you should have 2 files in there as part of this template. Okay. One of those files is referred to here in this line, which is add spend data equals pandas. This is our library that we're using. If you were here last week for Python, we're using a function called read CSV, since it's a CSV file. And then we're just giving it the file name, which we copied from here. We're giving it our file name to create our data frame. So first thing you need to do is make a data frame called performance data for the other file that's in our imported file section. Okay, so you should be able to add a line of Python to this cell. As a hint, it's going to look very similar to line 2 here, but you should come out of this with another data frame called performance data. Okay, so I'll let you get all of that, get that open. Does everybody see the 2 files on the left-hand side under files? Okay, great. All right, so go ahead and write another line here and give that a run. Okay. Ooh, okay. They'll be in the file section. So they'll show up here once you've created your data frames. So those are the, yeah, got it. The file names are all, man, there you go. Yeah, so just make sure to see this. We've mostly been using data browser, which is our little like stack of cookies type of thing. This one, we're going to be actually in our like file folder icon. That's where you'll see your file names. And has everybody gotten the hex and was able to copy the project and all that? Okay. Cool. All right, once you think you have a line here, I'll maybe get somebody to let us know what you got. You good? Ah, gotcha. Cool, sounds good. It's not a USB-C, is it? Because you can use mine. Yeah. I mean, you're welcome to watch. All right, anybody got a performance data frame? Yeah, what you got? All right, that sounds very promising. All right, I'm going to run that. I could either hit my run button. I'm going to do Command Enter on my keyboard. All right, and then I'm going to see down here that I've got my 2 data frames right here. And actually, I'm going to make a copy of this before I use my template real quick. But yes, that was exactly correct. All right, let me make a copy of this. Just modifying our template in case somebody else wants to use it later. Okay, sweet. Pop that in here. I'm gonna run this, make sure both of those show up. Great. One more thing I want to point out here. So these 2 lines with my notes that say add a line of code below, run the cell. These have our pound sign in front of those lines. That's the comment. So you can write any notes to yourself in your code cells, in your Python cells with just a pound sign in the front. That's a great, also gives you those little reminders to myself, or especially as you're learning. If you want to take any quick notes in there, you can do that with comments. Okay, did everybody got their second data frame to show up? We got a performance data. You can double check if you're not sure if it came up. Go in your data browser on the left-hand side, go in your data frames, which is the first option here, and you should see 2 like this. Cool. All right. Okay, next thing we're going to do is our first SQL queries. Okay, so you're going to want to create 2 SQL cells just to like look at a couple rows of each of these data sets and see what's going on. Okay, so this is our very simple kind of first SQL query that we recommend writing. You can go ahead in between these guys. You can, if you hover, you get this little add cell button. So you can do that, and that'll give you an option to add your SQL cell. Yeah.
The bottom.
Yep, so that's all the way, like when there's already existing cells, that's all the way at the bottom of the last cell. And then when you have existing cells, you can add between any of them. Yeah. All right, so you want to do your very basic kind of first SQL query, just look at a couple of rows. All right, so let's see if I'll remember how to do that. As a hint, we talked about it earlier in our little SQL review. right? But it's going to look something like this, okay? Give that a whirl, get a sense of what's in there. You should do 2 cells. You should do one for each of your data frames so you can see what each of them looks like. Okay. Remember that the first time you write a SQL cell, what Allie reminded of us of in the very beginning is you're going to need to make sure the source is correct. So when you're writing your SQL cell, I got my correct copy here. I'm going to add my SQL cell. The first time I do this in a project, it's not going to have a source assigned. All right, so I'm just going to want to tell it to use my data frames. Okay. Once you do that once in a project, it should default to that for any other SQL cells that you set up. Yeah.
Error parser.
Parser error. Okay. What's the error saying? Okay. Where do you have parentheses? Or do you have from running this one, you're saying? Okay. Where do you have parentheses?
Oh, you don't need it.
Very good. All right. Anybody got a select statement for this working? Yeah. Yeah, great. Beautiful. I'm gonna hit Command Enter. Let's run that. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm seeing some dates, I'm seeing some vendor names, and I'm seeing spent amount. I'm going to assume that's dollar amounts. Great. All right, people getting something similar, got this to run. Okay, great. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing on my other table, just so I can see what's in there. This is the kind of thing you always want to do with new data set. So do the same thing just with my other table name. And let's take a look at what's in here. Okay, so we have a few more columns in this one. We have UTM medium, UTM source, UTM campaign. Okay, if you don't know what UTMs are, they're basically tags that get added to URLs that can tell you where somebody clicked from. So if you've ever copy pasted a link from like a Facebook ad or something you clicked on the web, you might notice that there's like a normal looking link and then there's a bunch of like and signs and like codes and stuff towards the end. This is stuff that marketers use to figure out where your traffic came from. If you don't want people to know where your traffic came from, you could delete the UTM parts off the end of your link and just use the beginning part and it will still work and it won't be able to track you. So it just depends on how paranoid about that you are in the specific situation. But this is sort of a taxonomy that we use to, there's a few different codes, there's a couple others. This is sort of a simplified version. But typically it'll be sort of like what sort of type in general, which vendor, or which sort of other, what's the right word for this? Like website, I guess, or like general source. And then within each source, you might have different campaigns, right? So we're running Facebook ads, but we're running like a few different campaigns, maybe a few different versions of our ad, maybe a different promo, right? So these are our different codes. And then our data vendors, if you're using Google Ads or there's other kind of similar things, they can then trace how many times someone lands on your website from clicking on something that has this in the URL. Okay, so that's what we're getting here is our website visits. And then we're also getting, of all these website visits, what's the total purchases? How many people actually added our waterproof shoes to their cart and hit purchase from these website visits. So we've got our UTM information, we've got website visits, purchases, and then we've got months. So I'm going to assume that I've got data over some period of time in my data set. Okay, any questions about this, either data set or what we're kind of working with here? Make sense? Okay, so let's go, now that we've seen our data, let's go back up to our prompt a little bit. I guess just a general note about this document. So I've written these in Markdown, which is just sort of like a type of text where you can do a little bit of formatting. You'll notice some things like if you do some pound signs at the beginning, it'll create like a bold header. If I'm doing an individual one, it'll create a bullet point. The pairs of them will do bolding. You don't have to worry too much about that. It's just like a little documentation thing. When you're in this notebook view, you can hide you'll sort of see it twice because you'll see where it's written and then how it gets formatted. You can hide one of them if you don't want to see the double text. As a reminder, we can always switch over to our app builder view, which is going to hide by default any of your sort of code cells, but I've got sort of our text cells here. So if you want like a cleaner place to read that, it's there as well. Okay. Hide these. Cool. Okay. So we've got our data, we've done our initial queries. Okay, but let's go back to our question. All right, so we've got our two data sources, our marketing spend. So we've looked at that now, right? So we know our ad spend, we've got dates, vendors, amount spent, pretty straightforward. And then in our performance data set, we've got some information about which kind of source and campaign our data is coming from. And then for each of those, how many times do people go to the website? How much stuff do people buy? And then we're going to assume that this is divided by month over some period of time. Okay. Cool. So what we're going to do is take these two sets of data and try to understand some things about ROI of our spend. Okay, so ROI is return on investment. So when I'm a marketer and I'm spending money on advertising, ideally, I want people to purchase stuff after they click on my advertisement or hear my advertisement on a podcast, whatever, right? I want people to buy stuff. Ideally, I want people to buy more stuff than I spent money on than like my marketing budget. Make sense? So that's sort of the I'm sure someone else could teach you much more in depth about marketing analytics and all of the metrics and strategy behind that. But we're going to do sort of a basic version of, we know we're spending some money. Are we getting at least that much money back? And what's working the best? What's getting us the most money back on our budget? Okay, that's what we're going to be kind of doing today. All right, so we can already tell from these two, we've got two very similar data sources. One's got this spent amount, one's got this purchase amount. So we're already sort of starting to sense that we might need to do what with these two data sets? Join, combine, right? So we're already starting to think, okay, that's something I'm probably going to need to do with some SQL. Speaking of which, that's going to be our next step. So now that we've got our data loaded in, we've done some very simple Python to get it loaded into a data frame. Now we can interact with that data frame with SQL, just like a SQL table. Okay, so we just started doing that with our select star statements. Now we're going to do some data modeling. Okay, so data modeling is just writing a SQL statement that's going to get us closer to the columns and the rows and to just sort of the layout that we're going to need for our analysis. Okay, so typically what you're going to do in this process is you're going to look at your question, like we were talking about earlier, getting really specific on what's the question I have of my data. So what's my marketing ROI is kind of our broad question. So getting really specific on what my question is and then sort of stepping out what I need to do with my data to answer that question. Okay, I've done some of that stepping out for you here so that we can focus on the query writing part. But typically when you have a project, you're going to need to do some of the thinking through of, okay, I've got a bunch of spend data, I've got a bunch of performance data. How do I need to aggregate or combine to be able to answer my question? Okay, so just for the sake of time and to give you all a chance to practice the SQL and Python parts, I've done that for you here. So in order to do this analysis, we need to do a couple of data modeling tasks. First thing we need to do is we need to make it possible to join our two data sets. Okay, we've already, that was sort of just intuitive from looking at the problem. So you'll notice looking at our two data sets that here we have these vendor names, Google, Facebook, influencer, and I think podcasting is also further down if we've done maybe 20 rows or so. We would see that. Let's do one more. Take a quick look. Yeah, and we've got podcasts. Okay. And then in our performance data, we've got 4 different UTM sources. Okay, we've got Facebook, influencer, Google, and podcasts, but they're spelled slightly differently. So I'm not going to be able to join on them. Okay, so one of the first tasks we need to do is get some column formatted so that they're exactly the same. I'm basically going to want to add a column to this table that's going to be formatted exactly like this column so that I can join my data sets together. Okay, so that's our very first task that we need to do. So you can just call your data frame something like performance data 2. And the idea is to add a column to your data set that's going to use some logic to add our vendor name. Okay. So I'm not going to do that directly, but I'm going to give you an example from our previous week. So you want to add a SQL cell in here. We'll do this, and then we're going to kind of step through these four. If you're feeling really in your SQL, feel free to jump ahead and we'll catch up to you. You're going to want to add a SQL cell right here. You're going to work on your query, and then to rename your data frame once you have it written, you can double click on the name that it auto generates here and do a rename. Okay, so since we're going to be creating several data models, you're going to want to keep them labeled. Otherwise, the numbers get sort of hard to keep track of. All right. So adding a column, let me go back to our, this guy, I had some stuff from our week 1 class. Okay, well, hang on. I'm gonna have you all start thinking about that, and I'm gonna pull up my other example. Okay. So some things you want to be thinking about if you're, as you're getting started, are kind of a mini version of our data analysis process. Okay, put a slide over here. So we're asking our questions, right? Getting from our input to our output and figuring out what the first piece of information that we need is. So for this prompt, we need to add a column for our vendor. So the first thing we need to figure out is, how do I map between my UTM source and my vendor name? Okay, how do I figure out what are all the possible values of my UTM source? What are all my possible values of vendor? And what's my mapping going to be between that? Okay, that's the first piece of information that I'm going to need. It also might be handy if you have, and if you want to open up another hex tab with your project from week 1, a lot of the SQL stuff that we were using there, we're going to be using again today. All right, so you may need a couple queries to start thinking about this, but what are all the possible values for vendor? What are all the possible values for UTM source? How are we going to start to think about mapping those together? What query could we write to help us start to figure that out? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. That's just because the person you will sell you out of the source. Yeah. And just grab it to data frame. Yeah. And then just run it again. Looks like this is a slow plus again, maybe. Okay, cool. Very good. No problem. Yeah, if you get stuck, get an error or whatever, we're a small group, smaller, I'll help you out. Okay, so here's a little hint for this first one. All right, so first thing we need to do is just figure out what are all the possible vendors and what are all the possible UTM codes. Okay, so this is a query that I wrote. I'm going to leave it hidden for a moment. All right, where all I'm just doing is figuring out what are all the possible vendors from my data frame, from my ad spend data frame. Okay, I saw a bunch of repeats when I did my little sort of initial data investigation. Does anybody remember how to figure out what are all the unique values in our column? You can also, as I've talked about the last 2 weeks, remember that Hex has a built-in kind of AI assistant. So I would encourage you to either look back at week 1 project, or you can try giving it a prompt. It'll probably get you part of the way there, or might get you there. We don't know. It was a bit of a gamble with the AI assistant. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Select vendor from ads transfer data.
Okay. Cool. And what did that get back to you? Okay. Cool. And are there any repeats in that list?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Cool. So we should figure out what are all the possible options. Okay, you could probably kind of start to eyeball it and you can start to see, okay, I'm seeing the same 3 or 4. But how do we get our list? Anybody remember the keyword that we use to get down to our unique values? Yeah. Ah, great. Great. Okay, cool. So if we do that, let's come in here and do select. Okay, so same thing you started with back here, select vendor from ad spend data. And I'm going to do group by vendor. Beautiful. Okay, great. So I'm just taking only my vendor information, and then I'm grouping by that same column, which is basically going to eliminate any duplicates, right? It's doing the group by. The other way that you can do this is a perfectly valid way to do this. The other way you can do this, which I think we talked about last week, is you can add this word distinct after you select, and that'll just that'll give you any unique values. So I can do my same query we had before, select vendor from ad spend data. If I add distinct, it's going to do exactly the same thing as our group by in this case. Okay, so the results it's giving me are the same. It's 4 unique values. Those are my 4 unique values. Okay, awesome. All right, so I figured out what my possible options for my vendor are. How do I figure out my possible options for my UTM source? Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. I remember with group by, you can either do the column name or just whatever number column it is. So I can do group by 1 is the same thing as grouping by my first column. I could also say group by UTM source, but it's going to do the exact same thing here. Okay. That's the great part about SQL. There's sort of a few patterns to learn. And then once you learn it, it's just sort of applying the same pattern again, right? So you're going to write a very similar query or same query over and over on your different data sets in your different projects. That's kind of how it works. Okay. All right, so I've got these 4 vendors. I've got my UTM sources giving me these 4 UTM sources. Okay, I'm going to use my eyeballs and look at these: Google, Facebook, influencer podcasts, Facebook, influencer, Google podcasts. Okay, looks like there's a pretty clear intuitive mapping as to what these are. This is great. We've gotten nice clean data. You get data in the real world. You're probably going to have 6 or 7 of these and like 4 of these, and it's not going to be totally clear, and you're going to have to do some data cleanup. That's something you're likely to encounter. Someone's already given you very clean data for this project. You're welcome. So we have a very clear mapping of what we need to map to one another. Okay, so all we basically need to do is add a column to our performance data that's going to have our UTM source. When our UTM source says Facebook, we want it to say Facebook ads with our capital letters here, like we have here. When it says influencer, we're going to want it to have influencer marketing with our capital letters, right? So we're all ready to join our data. This is a data modeling step, right? So does anyone remember how to add a new column in our SQL query from our select statement? So what we're going to do is very similar to what we're doing in this query. Okay, where we grabbed season and episode number, which already existed in our data. Then we created a new column. All right, we created a new column using this case logic. Okay. In this case, we were counting, which we're not going to do here. We essentially did some if then, right? So if the character equals Elaine, then in this case, we have a specific value. In that case, we had something we were counting. We were counting lines of dialogue. When our condition, then our output. And we can have as many when then lines as we want before we put end. Okay, so we can have as many of those as we want. So what you're going to be doing in this step, so you're going to be adding this column right to your performance data set. So when you're adding a column, you want to take all your existing columns. So we're going to do star comma. And then you're going to want to use a structure very similar to this to add our additional column. Okay, so you should think about what you want to call your additional column. Probably something similar to what it's called in the other data set. Okay, something about vendor. And how might you use this setup, our case when something, then something, end, to match between our list of 4 UTM sources and our list of 4 vendors? How might we do that? I don't have a stab at how we're doing our new column. You don't want to take a stab at it. If you're feeling a little stuck, I'm going to start with some setup. Okay, so looking at our example, we had case when something, I'm gonna leave that blank right now, then something, leave that blank right now, end. Okay, that's our basic setup that we need to figure out what to fill in. But I know I want my column. I'm gonna use as to name my column. I'm gonna call it vendor, just because in my other data frame, it's already called vendor. So that'll be a good clue to my brain that I'm trying to replicate that column. Okay. All right. So I got my little outline of my case statement. Now I just need to figure out what needs to happen in my when, what's my condition? And in that case, what results do I need? I'm starting from performance data, right? I'm starting from these. So when my UTM source is Facebook, for example, let's pick one to start. What should my vendor column say? Anyone have a stab? Yeah, no, sorry.
I did, UTM source.
Okay.
To Facebook, the small one, and then
Right.
add Facebook ads.
Great. And then we're going to do Facebook. We'll look at how it's spelled up here, do Facebook ads. Right. And then, like I always recommend when you're writing SQL, I just wrote a little bit. I didn't deal with all my cases yet, right? I only did Facebook. Let's just see if this runs. Let's just write a little bit and see if that works. Okay, let's see what we got here. Okay. So my first row, UTM source is Facebook. I see my new column over here with vendor. Ooh, I see Facebook ads. Okay, pretty cool. I get down to influencer, blank. Okay, that makes sense. I didn't do anything with that. Okay, so we've got a really good start. Now I can add as many when then combos in here before I get to my end, because I like to indent them a little bit so they're a little easier to read. I'm gonna add basically some more copies of this line to handle each of my cases, okay? In this case, we've only got 4, so my data set's pretty simple. There's more complicated ways you can do this if you had like 100 of these. You wouldn't need to like sort of type them all out, but that's what I'm gonna do in this case. So I'm just gonna run down my list here. Influencer. Make sure I spell it the same way, it's all lowercase, then, and then I'm gonna go up and see from my query, this is why we did these queries, what it's called. I'm actually just gonna copy paste this because I have a tendency to have typos. All right, then influencer marketing. All right, let's run that and see if that worked. Okay, next one filled in, and then I'm gonna repeat that 2 more times, okay, for my other 2 cases. Okay, so go ahead and do that also. All right, make sure my capitalization works. Make sure you have end at the end of your case, okay? So you have as many when thens as you need, and then you should just have an end and close your parentheses. All right, so I'm gonna run that and take a look over here at my vendor column. Okay, I see examples of all 4. Looks like it's working pretty good. I know I've covered all my values because I checked what all my values were beforehand. Great. Okay, this is looking pretty good. Now my last thing is I know I'm going to use this again later, so I want to give it a helpful name. Yeah, question. Yes, good question. What would happen if we didn't include UTM source equals?
Oh, I guess it wouldn't know it's called.
Exactly. Yep. So we got to tell it which column. Very good. Okay. So last thing I want to do is make sure I rename this. So I gave you guys a sample name here, performance data 2. You can do whatever, but you can see the default that it named it is data frame 6. That's going to be hard for me to remember when we have 12 data frames. So I'm just going to double click in the green here and change my name, hit enter. And then once you change the name, you also should run it again just to make sure it is saved under the new name. And then in your data browser, you'll see your performance data 2. And you'll see that it has 7 columns because it's got vendor. Whereas if I look at my original performance data, it's just got my 6 columns, no vendor. Okay. So everybody should have another data frame. You call it performance 2, whatever, call it something, you'll know what it is. And it's got my vendor column that we added with this logic. All right. Okay. Any questions about how we got to performance data 2? Everybody with me? Sorta, kind of, sorta. Okay, great. All right. So that's our first data modeling task. Our next data modeling task is to create a data frame called total spend that has the spend for each vendor. Okay. So our results should have one row per vendor. So vendor, and then the total spend, total that we've spent on ads with this vendor. And then we want to name it total spend. All right, so the result you're trying to get to, do I have a good example of this? Yeah, so I'm gonna leave the code hidden, but you're trying to get to something like this, okay, where we have for each vendor, how much total did we spend? Okay, how much total did we spend? Think back to our SQL setup. All right, you might want to think about which of these you might want to add in to get your total. Okay. How do we get our number of rows down to just those 4 rows? And then how do we get our total? All right, so we're trying to get to something that looks like this. 1 row for each vendor with our total spent. Anybody think they know how to do this? Yeah.
I did select vendor to some parentheses spent on. That's what we.
Great. Group by. Perfect. Group by, because we know we want to condense our rows down, right? We're doing like a pivot table sort of thing where we want, we know we have a bunch of rows for Facebook ads, we have a bunch of rows for Google ads. We want to combine, so we want to use group by. Very good. All right, I think that is exactly what I have here. Let me check. Yep, exactly. And then group by, I could have written vendor, I could have written one, whatever is easier, clearer for you. Select vendor, total up my spent amount. So I'm going to use my sum function. Remember that we also have count, we have average, we have a few other kind of basic math functions that we can do here. But a common one we're going to use is sum. And then I'm going to do my group by to condense my rows. Okay, and then last thing I would do here is I would recommend renaming this. I called it total spend. So make sure you rename your little data frame and run it again, just so you have your stuff labeled. And once I do that, I can just go double check in my data browser that I've got total spend and I've got my 2 columns. Okay, everybody understand what the group by is doing here and how we're getting to our sum? If I'm not sure, this is also a good time to scroll back to that very first query that we wrote, where we grabbed just a few rows from our thing, and I can see, okay, Google looks like we spent just from at least a few $1,000s from this first. Facebook, we spent a few $1,000s. So I could come back down here to this thing that we just wrote. Our spent amount, okay, it's like a bunch of $1,000s. It's like a gut check. That makes sense to me. The number is like ballpark correct, right? That's the kind of thing you want to check for at each step. Okay, very good. All right, now we're going to do something very similar, but with a little bit more. So we're going to do another data frame called performance summary that's going to summarize our performance info by vendor. Okay, so let's remind ourselves what our performance info is. All right, now it says by vendor, so I know I got to use my data frame that we made earlier that has vendor, right? It's a good thing we did that, because this guy doesn't have vendor, no column for vendor. So when I use my performance data 2 or whatever you called it, it's got my vendor. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I want to do my number of distinct campaigns. Remember, we used distinct before, so think about how we could do that. Total website visits and total purchases. And remember that we just did total spend. Okay, so it's going to be very similar. Okay, so we want to summarize by vendor. So summarize, we used one of our keywords before for that, right? And we want to get 3 things. We want to get the number of campaigns, number of distinct campaigns, total website visits, and total purchases. Okay. The code hidden again, but your goal is to get to something that looks like this. Okay, row for each vendor, our total website visits, total purchases, total campaigns. Okay. you're not sure how to get all three of these columns, I would say just start with one. See if you can get vendor name and one of those columns to start, get that working, and then work on adding your next column. It's good to start with one and then add more. All right, does anybody have at least one of these columns? Not been working yet. Maybe somebody who hasn't raised their hand yet. You wanna maybe haven't raised your hand yet. You wanna tell us what you got so far? Maybe we can go from there. Okay, we walk through this one together. All right, so for my first column for website visits, I'm going to be doing something very similar to this guy, right? Because what I did before is I added up total spend amount. For website visits, I'm just adding up my website visits. All right, so I should have something that looks very similar to this. Get my website visits column. Does anybody have website visits? Got our vendor and our website visits. Something similar to this? Yeah. All right. Cool. So what would this be? This would be select our vendor and then sum of what? Website visits. Very good. As website visits, give it another name. Great. And do my group by one. Okay, that's going to get me to here. What about purchases? How do I get my total purchases?
Data set or the performance data to set.
Well, let's see. What are we trying to get to? We're trying to get to our performance information by vendor. So which data set should we use for that? Two, because that's the one that has the vendor. Very good. We can't summarize by vendor from this data set because it doesn't have the vendor. Very good. All right, so coming from our performance data 2. All right, total purchases. Very similar, right? We're going to be using our sum function, just like we did sum of spent amount up here. We're going to do sum of total purchases to get this guy. All right. So here we only had one sort of summarized column. If I wanted to add more, I would just do a comma and I can do as many more as I want. Okay. All right. So those are my first two columns. Pretty straightforward. Make sure I've got my group by vendor, group by one. What about our count of campaigns? How do we do that? Anybody get our count of campaigns column? reminder, one of the first queries we always want to write is something like this. This might give you a little inspiration, similar to our sum function. All right, so how do we get our number of campaigns? All we're going to do is we're going to use our count function just like we used our sum function. Okay. So unhide this. All right. So vendor, these first two lines are very similar to what I did here, right? I'm just doing a sum of the column and then I'm just giving it that same column name again. So I'm just doing my as so that it just has a column name. Otherwise, like sort of calculations the column won't have a name unless I give it a name. So some visits, some purchases, pretty straightforward. I've just got commas in between. I can add as many sums, counts, whatever as I want. Okay, then I'm going to do count of my UTM campaign, okay, as my number of campaigns. I'm doing performance data 2 because I've got my vendor and I'm still just doing my group by 1. So even though I've added multiple summary columns, the only place I need to group is by vendor because all of these are rolling up, right? Okay. All right, so let's take out our distinct here. Say we just started with count. Let's run. Let's see if that runs. Fantastic. All right, we've got our number of campaigns. Now, what I don't know about my data set is whether the number of campaigns are whether I have multiple rows for each campaign. I didn't check that yet. Okay, so I have two options. I could either check that, kind of like we did with these queries, right, where we just went to see, okay, what are all the options? What are all the distinct values for source and for vendor? I ran a separate query, so I knew exactly how many there were, whether there were repeats. So I could do that here, or I could just add the word distinct here to just make sure that if there are any duplicate rows, if there's any like kind of multiple rows about the same campaign, it's just going to count the number of campaigns separately. Now in this case, it looks like it's the same, so that I may or may not need the distinct. All right, but I would either want to run another query and check, or probably would want to use that, right, to make sure I'm not counting. Just because a campaign is mentioned several times in my data doesn't mean there's that many more campaigns, right? It might be the same campaign. Okay, everybody clear on how we got to this table? Does everybody have something that looks kind of like this? Performance summary. Okay. And then same deal with all of these. I would rename this something like performance summary so that I know, or performance by vendor or something like that. So you remember what it is. Find it right here. Make sure it looks good. All right. Feeling good. Okay. Great. We're going to continue on to our next and last data modeling task for right now, where we're going to do a join. Okay. So what I'm sort of teeing up for us here, we've made a model called total spend. That one had a row for each vendor. We've made a model called performance summary that again has a row for each vendor. We knew from the beginning that what we were trying to do is join our two data sets together. So now that's exactly what we're going to do. So we've done some prep work on each of them. We couldn't join them in the way that they work. They have different numbers of rows, right? Different levels of detail. So now we've made two data frames from each of our sources that now have the same number of rows. And they each have a column, right? Performance summary has a vendor column and 4 rows. And our total spend has a vendor column and 4 rows. So now this is going to be super easy to join. Okay. If you want to create one, you can just call it something like joined if you like, that joins those two tables together using the vendor name. Okay. So a reminder of what a join looks like. Bring up my little join example again. The join is this last example here. So we pretty much always want to use left join. That's kind of the simplest kind of join. All right. And then we just need to tell it what columns we want, which two tables we're joining, and then which column or columns we're joining on. Okay. So you should write a query. You should do a new SQL cell, write a query that's kind of in this structure, but it's going to join the two data frames we just created, performance summary and total spend. Okay, so that we can get one row with spend and performance for each vendor, which is going to allow us to do our analytics in a little bit, or our kind of analysis in a little bit. All right, anybody got the join working or getting an error with the join? You got some? Not yet? What do you got so far? That's okay. All right, well, how would we start? What columns do we want to grab? Yes, right. So those are two tables. So what I want to do is grab my two tables. So let's do, pop in here, do new query. Okay. So I want everything from performance summary. So I'm going to start with just a very simple select star from one of my tables. Okay, I can even run that and just make sure that it runs. Okay, that's where I should always start. Okay, now I want to join. What was the other table you said? Total spend? Okay, so I know from looking at my little structure here that my other table name is going to go after my left join. Okay, so then I'm going to need to do here is, where did I come in here? All right, so I'm going to do my left join. And then my other table name, which is, I can always double check it in my little thing here, total spend. All right, so I got select star from performance summary, left join, total spend. All right, let's try to run that. Uh-oh, got an error at end of input. End of input is here. Let's go look back at this thing. I'm missing my using. And using is going to tell me what? Season and episode number in this example are the names of what? Columns. So I'm going to need my column name. So what's the column name that I need for this one to join on? What's the column that those two have in common? Vendor. Great. Great question. So, or great point. So when we look at our performance summary, we got vendor, website visits, total purchases, and number of campaigns. So we don't have spent amount in this one, actually. Spent amount is a column in here, but the only column that these two have in common is vendor. So I actually, in this example, I only need to join on one column. In my example here, I was joining on two because multiple seasons could have the same episode number. So I was looking at both. But in this case, it's actually even easier. I just need the one column. Okay. And hopefully I named them the same thing. So if the column has the same name, I can just do this using vendor thing. So total spend, it's called vendor. And in my performance summary, it's also called vendor. So column has the same name and I know that the values align. And so then when I run this guy, I'm gonna think for a second. Okay, and now I have something that looks exactly like performance summary, but with one more column. It's got spent amount because I'm doing my select star. So it's getting all the columns from both of these tables, and total spend just has one more column. Besides vendor, it just has spent amount. So I'm bringing that, I'm essentially gluing that column on. Now I could have been like, imagine doing this in Excel, right? I totally could have done this. I would have had this little data set in Excel. And then I would have said, okay, Facebook ads. I'm going to go copy this value, this 38 something. I'm going to paste it in a new column here. I'll go to influencer marketing, grab this, paste it here. I have to do each one because they're not in the same order, right? That's how I would have done it in Excel. That's exactly what we're doing here. Just doing this little bit of logic with our using. Okay. Everybody get a join working. Everybody's got some data set that looks like this. We've got spent and purchases. Remember, these are purchases that people are making on the website. So this is sort of revenue we're making back. And spent is what we spent on ads. So that's what we're trying to get together. And then again, I'm going to rename this to joined. Actually, I think in this one, I already have a joined. Did I write the same thing twice? Yes, I did. Okay. So I'm just going to delete this. So I don't have a duplicate, but this is the same thing that I just wrote. Okay. Or in this case, I did it the other way. I said, select everything from total spend, left join performance summary on vendor. Since I already checked that both of my data frames have the same rows, this is all good to go. I already did the data modeling work. It's all clean. I can do total spend and then join on performance summary or vice versa. It's going to give me the same results. Okay. All right. So that's all my data modeling work. All right. So I think this is the biggest thing that I have sort of learned in my work about doing this kind of data analysis project is if you want to be able to get to something like a metric, you have to do a lot of this. Sometimes people call this munging or data cleaning or data modeling is the most common term that I have heard it called. you're basically like manipulating each of your data sources, joining them together, getting them into a format where you can do your other calculations much easier, okay? All right, so now we've got this super clean, cool table. It's got all the columns we could possibly need, and it's already all broken down by vendor. Awesome. Okay. So now we're going to look at some very basic marketing metrics. Again, I'm not a marketing expert, so you guys might know more about this than me, but we're going to pick a couple of simple ones to start with. Okay. So you should have something like joined. If you don't have something like joined, wave your hand at me after this and I'll help you get to here so that we can, because without this, you're gonna have trouble moving forward. All right, so you should have something like joined with all these columns. And then, great, okay. And we'll just notice here, sorry, one last comment on this is that our columns are just in a different order here than they were before because I did spend first this time. So in this case, my spent amount comes first, and then my columns from performance summary comes second. The column order doesn't matter, it just depends on whether you do, which one goes on the from and which one goes on the join. Okay, but they're the same. All right. Okay, so we're gonna do a very simple marketing metric called cost per visit. Okay, CPV, cost per visit, is just the total amount that we spent on advertising, so spent amount, divided by the number of website visits. Okay, this makes sense to us. So if we spent $10,000 on marketing and we got 10 visits to our website, that'd be $1,000 per visit is what this metric will come out to be. That's pretty expensive for one click on your website, right? So we want to figure out what this metric is. So this one we can do in either SQL or Python. Okay, so we're starting from our joined data set that we've got here. I want you to add a column called CPV that's going to do this calculation for each of our rows. Okay, this can be done in either SQL or Python. If you're feeling good today, you can do a SQL cell and a Python cell and try it in both. Okay. As a reminder, if you want to try it in Python, it might look something like this. Okay, so whatever data frame, in this case, it's our joined one. I'm going to give my column a new name. In this case, it might be something like CPV or cost per visit. I would do an equal sign, and then I would do whatever math operation I want to do on my other columns. All right, so in this case, it's our division formula. This example is doing some addition, right? It's gonna, you're gonna write, you could do one line of Python that looks very similar to this. This can also be done in SQL in a very similar way if you prefer. Just remember that if you want to do Python, you got to do a Python cell, which is this little guy right here. It's SQL. This up as inspiration. So go ahead and add your CPV column. What is our cost per visit to our website based on our spent amount? Anyone either have a new column or an error on their new column? Trying to get your new. Yeah, you got a column? All right, what you got?
Joined underscore CPV, open bracket, CPV equals to join spent amount divided by join total website visits.
All right, so you had joined, sorry, let me type this one with you. Joined CPV. Okay. Mhm. Like this, spent amount in here. Okay. Spent amount. Sweet. Okay. Great. Total website visits. All right, let's see. And then in my joined, I think I just called this website visits. So I'm just going to change that to match my column name, but spent amount is the same. Okay, great. And what happened when you ran this?
The data from my word joins.
All right. Let's see. Okay. So you got, did I mistype this? Did you have an extra CPV in here? Did I have an extra underscore?
Okay, I see in this join CVP, yeah, here.
Oh, you have a,
No, basically you made, so what you did is made a copy and then if you click on join secret there. Well, that's fine. I'm okay.
the only thing I would have done differently is just because I already have my data frame is called joined. I would have just made this joined so that I'm just adding my column to my existing one. And then that's, maybe you might have run this and then you added your CPV and run it again. That would have made a copy. That's all that happened. Okay, so, great. So I ran this. So when you're adding a column to an existing data frame, the name of your data frame here can just be the same because you're just adding it on. Yeah. If you rename it here, it can also save a copy as well. Okay, great. And then if I want to check that this worked, I can check over here in my joined, make sure I have a column called CPV. For Python like this, it usually won't print out a preview unless I can do another line where I just write joined. I just write the name of my data frame, run it again, and that's just going to print out what's in my data frame. Okay, so in SQL, if I want it to print out, I would just select star from joined, right, to print it out. In a Python cell, I can just write the name of the data frame and it'll just spit it out there for me in a little preview mode. Make sense? All right, so did everybody get like a spent amount divided by website visits? Make sense? And then I've got my column and then just to do like a gut check. All right, looks like this is like $40,000. This is like 10,000 website visits. So this is going to be like $4-ish, 356. Yeah, that checks out. Math checks out. Looks about right. Yeah. We're going to get to that in a second. I did some of this before, and so it has the columns that we're about to add. So, yep. Because, and the reason they're showing up here is because I already ran the code down below, so they've already run. But those are the ones we're about to write, actually. So we'll get into that right now. Yes, I can. Did anybody do it in SQL already? No. Okay. So let's go to a SQL cell right here. All right. So for SQL, what I would do is I would start with a select star from my data frame. All right. And then how do I add a column in SQL? I just add a comma. All right. And then I'm going to do very similar formula to what we did before. Anybody know what my little formula I would write here is to make my new CPV column, to do the same thing that we just did in Python? Close, not close. Basically the same as what we did here. So all we need to do, because we don't have to do sum because it's already grouped. So we're not like further grouping down. We're just operating on each individual row. So in this case, I can just do spent amount divided by website visits as, I'm gonna call this CPV2. Let's run this. And then I get my CPV2 column over here. It's still giving me my original CPV because I've already operated on my data frame. But so the operation I'm doing is exactly the same as we did before. It's just divide. And the reason I don't have to do sum is because the sum is what is a condensing function. So we do when we have a group by, because we don't need to group here. We don't need to do that. We're just doing the simplest math ever. Just one little operation between our two columns. I could add them together, whatever other like math operations. here. And because I'm not doing group by, it's just going to go across each row and do this math and put it in CPV2. All right, so this is a case where it's like pretty equally simple to do it between Python and SQL. So just up to you and whatever you're comfortable with. I personally in this case would probably choose Python only because Python will let you add a column to the data frame with the same name. Every time you write a SQL query, it's going to give you a new data frame. And then I have joined 7, 8, 9, and then it's like hard to keep track of the names. So in this particular case, I would probably go with this one, but operationally it's no different. You can use either, depending on what you want to do.
Data from SQL.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just going to make a copy of it. Yeah. Yeah. Which in some cases is what you want, or is easier to keep track of, or is just, fine for your use case. That's totally good. In my case, I just have a slight preference for doing it this way, but both totally valid. All right, cool. Okay, now that we did that, we're going to do something very similar. Very similar, but it's just a different marketing metric. Okay, return on ad spend, or ROAS. It's a marketing metric. That's just the total purchases that were made divided by the total spend. So purchases that our customers made divided by our total spend. So we're going to add our column. Okay, same deal. This is almost identical to what we just did. So you can either do it in Python or SQL. I encourage you to try the other one. If you just did it in Python, try SQL or vice versa. So the metric that you're going to add is ROAS. Okay, total purchases divided by total ad spend. Very similar to CPV. All right, so give it a try in SQL or Python or both. Okay. Should be adding a column called ROAS, or if I'm doing it in SQL, I'll have a new data frame with a column called ROAS. And I should be getting something that looks like this. Does anybody have a ROAS column in there? Yeah, Allie, you want to read us yours?
I didn't join bracket.
Okay.
And then equals, and I have joined purchases in the brackets and quotes, and then divide by joined and
Perfect. Okay, so basically an exact copy of this line. We've just swapped out what our new column name is, and then we've swapped out our two columns that we're operating on, but even the division is the same, right? We're just operating on our different columns. I think I wrote it out here. Yeah, so that's exactly what you just said. And then I just typed join again, only because I wanted to see my little preview and make sure that it made sense. So I'm going to do that and see my little printout. Again, just do my kind of like basic check. Okay, my total purchases is 90,000. I spent 40,000, so it should be like a little over 2. All right, yeah, 2.3, great. Just kind of like gut check, make sure it's working. Okay. All right. Everybody got your ROAS column. If you did it in SQL, you should have something that looks very similar to this. You should have something that says as ROAS, and then you should have division like this, but with our two other columns, right? With our total purchases and spent amount. Did anybody do it in SQL? Get it to work? Yeah, sweet. Okay, cool. Yeah, this is the perfect case of just whatever you're more comfortable with is the perfect tool to use. Yeah.
I did it in Python, but then in SQL and getting data to make an error.
Okay, in your SQL cell, you might just want to double check over here that it's selecting from data frames. Make sure that's working and then run it again and see. That might fix it. Yeah, sweet. It should usually default to that, but sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, that's always a good thing to check. Okay. All right, so we've got some basic metrics going, right? And this is great because this was super simple, whether you did it in Python or SQL, this is a super simple line of code to write. And the reason it's super simple is because we did all this stuff up here where we did our summarizing and we got our data into a point where we can just do our simple operations to get our metrics, right? Okay, excellent. Okay, So now we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into this, okay? So before we do that, let's just take a quick like human eyeball look at our data, right? Okay, so we know that ROAS is gonna be how of what we like basically the ratio to what our customers spent to what we spent. So we want that ratio to be high, right? We want our customers to buy a lot when we spend a little bit on ads. We don't want it to be the other way. We don't want them to spend a little when we spend a lot on ads. Something like that would be like less than 1 or like a small decimal, that'd be bad. So we want it to be more than 1, preferably like multiple of 1, okay? So let's look at our ROAS results. All right, it looks like our Facebook ads are ROAS 2.35. Our podcasts are also above 2.18. And then our influencer marketing and our Google ads are 1.2-ish. Okay, so just from an initial look at our channels, it looks like Facebook ads and podcasts are better from a ROAS perspective than our influencer marketing and our Google ads. Yeah. Okay. So we've got some intuition for which of our channels are most successful based on this. Now, we know from our original data that we have multiple campaigns within each channel, right? When we did our initial look at our data, let's go back up here. Did I hide it for space? Yes. Okay, so within Facebook, I was running 4 different campaigns, and within podcasts, I was running some different podcasts. And within, right, so I'm running some different things. So now that I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, it looks like Facebook and podcasts are doing better, but which campaigns? Which campaigns? How would I figure out CPV and ROAS for the campaign level instead of just at the vendor level? Okay. Now, for both of these metrics, I need to know how much ad spend I did. And we'll notice that my spend data, let's see, my original spend data just has vendor and spent amount. My original spend data doesn't have which campaign I spent it on. Okay, so I'm missing some data. All right, now in this case, I'm gonna go talk to the marketing director, and she says, all right, actually for these campaigns, the spend was just split evenly. So we did 4 Facebook campaigns. We split our full Facebook budget evenly again across those 4. Okay, that's what she told me. So we saw that it was like billed throughout the year in various different lines in our original ad data. That's okay, but we know it's supposed to be divided evenly between the campaigns. All right. So that means we need to do a little bit of math. We need to find out of the total from each vendor, how much went to each campaign. So we're going to make the assumption that every vendor spread their budget evenly against however many campaigns they did. All right, and we need to find what their budget was then for each campaign, for each vendor, okay? So we're basically gonna need to create a new data model or add a column to our existing data model where we're looking at, okay, for each, our end goal, what we need to do is to get to a model for campaigns that's gonna look like this. So we're trying to get to where we have a row for each campaign, so it's gonna be more rows, right? With a CPV and a ROAS for each, so we can get a little bit deeper into our channels. In order to do that, first thing we need to figure out, first data modeling task that we need to do is figure out the total spend on each campaign. So looking at our joined data, here's where I've added this column. So this is what you want to get to. All right, but we see total for Facebook, we spent this much. And we also counted how many campaigns we ran on Facebook. All right, so what I need to do is write either a line of Python or a line of SQL like we just did before. What simple math can I do between my total spend and my number of campaigns to get just a per campaign budget number? How much did we spend if we ran 4 campaigns on Facebook and we split our total Facebook budget evenly among those 4? How much did we spend on each 4? How would I add a column that I would figure that out? And then same influencer marketing is easy because we just ran one campaign. For Google ads, we ran 3 different campaigns and we ran on 5 different podcasts. Okay, so for each of those, I want to know how much did we spend on each campaign. Okay, so you should have something very similar to what we had before up here, right? But you can call it per campaign spend or, budget per campaign, something like that. All right, who wants to tell me the basic math we're doing? What's the what's the math to figure out spend per campaign? It'd be very similar to what we did before.
Like spent amount divided by.
Beautiful. Spent amount divided by number of campaigns. Super easy. And what's great is we already did number of campaigns. All right. So maybe we haven't used that number yet. So it's possible that in my original data modeling, I might not have had as number of campaigns column. All right. But when I get here, I realize that I'm going to need it, right? Because I realize I'm going to need to figure out my per campaign spend. In that case, I can go back up to my original data modeling piece. Where did I do my little summary? Yeah, I might have just had it without this last line, right? You can imagine just to do ROAS, I didn't need number of campaigns. So I might have just written it like this. If that, in that case, I can just scroll back up, add this line in, add my number of campaigns. And when I hit run here, it's going to run fun little tidbit here. So it's going to run this cell and all descendant cells. So any cells that reference performance data or performance summary later, the output of the cell, if I come and update this, any cells later will recalculate to grab this extra column. Okay. So that's actually what happened when I was setting this up for you all today. I got down here, make sure this is going to work. And I was like, oh, shoot, I forgot number of campaigns. Went back up and added it. Okay. So that's exactly why doing it in cells like this is really helpful versus if you were just doing this by hand in Excel and you had a few different Excel tabs, you have to like remember what you changed in your other Excel tab and come like paste it over again. So this is super easy because you can trace back what you did and it'll auto recalculate anything that changes based on what you used before. All right, excellent. So hop in here. Great. So exactly what you just said, spent amount divided by number of campaigns, and then just give it a name that makes sense. I called it per campaign spend. And then I see that I've got that in my data set now. Okay, so now I'm going to make one more data model called campaigns. Okay, so before we were doing this at a vendor level. So our summary was vendor and then a bunch of things. One second. Vendor and then a bunch of things. All right, so now I want to do this at a level where I have campaign and then my sort of summary or statistics based on campaign instead of vendor. Okay, so we're going to do very similar to what we just did. We're going to do it at the campaign level instead of our vendor level. All right, so what we got to do is start from our data set that has our campaign on it, which is going to be our performance data 2. Right, that's kind of our original. We did a little bit of cleanup on it, but it's kind of our most original data source. It's got our campaigns. And before, when we summarized by vendor, now we're going to be summarizing by campaign instead. All right, but we still want our website visits and our total purchases. Okay, so so you should get some sort of result that looks something like this. So instead of a row for each vendor, we're going to have more rows. We're going to have a row for each campaign, but we still want this total visits and total purchases. All right, just starting from so we'll add on our spend data in a second, but for right now, just start from our performance data. Want to summarize by campaign instead of vendor. Yeah, question. Oh, got it. You can just overwrite the column. So if you have a column, do another column with the same name, it'll just overwrite the column that you had before. Oh, got it. If it has a different name. Yeah, you can just leave it hanging out. It's not doing any harm to anybody just hanging out there. I think there is a way to, I believe there is a function to delete it. Oh, actually, probably the best way to delete it would be just delete your line of code that had that column and then go to the top of your project and do restart and run all, and it'll just rerun everything from the beginning. And so if now that that line of code is gone, it won't run that again. That's probably the easiest way to get rid of it. All right. So you're starting from performance data 2, and you want to get a summary by campaign, and we need those same metrics we had before. We had website visits and purchases. Okay, so what would my query look like to summarize by campaign? I would do select and then what? All right, does anybody have a by campaign data model? It's okay if it doesn't look quite like this yet, but you should have a column for campaign, you should have a row for each campaign. And if you're stuck with where to start, maybe start with website visits. All right, now what I would do if I were you is, I know that we want website visits and total purchases. I know we did that before. We did that before in another query for vendor. I would go back up and copy paste that query and start from there. So I would probably go back up to this thing. I would probably copy paste this, paste it into a new cell and just figure out what I need to change. So before I did this by vendor, I want to do it by campaign. So I'd copy paste this and then maybe just change out that one thing that's different. So when I do that, I have something like this. All right, I have my UTM campaign, and then these two lines, these three lines are exactly the same as my other query. I did my sum of website visits, total purchases, total purchase. Okay. These three lines are exactly the same as when I did this for my vendor summary model before, or for my performance summary model before, right? I just switched out UTM. Now I could have just started with that, right? Exactly what I just did here. Ooh. All right, and just had UTM campaign and website visits. But I know that I'm going to want to use this data that we just did, right? Our per campaign spend is by vendor, right? I know I'm going to need vendor later because I want to still need to attach this per campaign spend to each of my campaigns. So I kept vendor in here as another column, okay? So I have two columns like this, and then I have my two summarized columns. In this case, I'm just doing a sum, but it could be a count, average, whatever. So if I run this, it's going to give me an error. And it's going to say a column vendor must appear in the group by clause or must be part of an aggregate function. This is actually a very helpful error message. Either add it to the group by list or use any name vendor to like summarize it basically, right? So the reason it's complaining is I've told it to group by one column, but I've really given it two columns and it's only grouping by the first one and then it's getting confused, okay? So I can add comma 2, or I could have said comma vendor, either one. I can give it column numbers or column names. And then it's going to give me something like this. Okay, so this is very similar to what I had before where it was just by vendor, but it's just more, the data word for this is disaggregated, right? I'm showing it at a deeper level of detail. Yeah, question. Mm-hmm. On the first line, you mean like right here? Yeah, you can have it on the same line, that's fine. Exactly the same thing. As long as you have the commas in between, it's exactly the same thing. Just it's a common convention to sort of put everything on its own line just for easy to read. But totally up to you. You can also, like all this could be on the same line Actually, this entire query could be on the same line. You just have to scroll to the right to read it, which is kind of annoying. Yeah, question. Yes, great question. Okay, so select just means instead of, so here I typed out UTM campaign, I typed out vendor, I typed out the names of which column I wanted. Asterisk is just all of them. Give me all of them. All the columns, whatever their names are, give me them all. Yep, so it's super easy. And it's also good for count. So if you just want your number of rows, you can do count star as a roll up and it'll give you, here we go, just the number of rows. So in this case, I have 12 rows for each campaign because I have a month's worth of data for each campaign. So that's another place you can use star. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question? Cool. Yeah. Sweet. All right. Yeah, we could do this. This is one. So typically when you're going to do your like data modeling step, you can do this in Python. I would recommend doing this in SQL. This just sort of structure is a little similar. You can do this in Python. You're going to do like it's like a dot sum type of thing. It can be done. I would recommend doing this step in SQL because it's just easier to read. Yeah. Sweet.
It showed an error in not sure why.
All right. What's the error say?
Invalid syntax and select UTM campaign.
Okay. Do you have a comma between UTM campaign and your next thing? Okay, let's take a look.
And when I say fix with magic, it's coming up with the blue.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that fix it. Oh, not really. Yeah, fix with magic doesn't work very well in my experience. Magic, I have found that magic works best for like your first draft, have it write your first thing, and then you fix it from there. It's really not very good at fixing it. Okay, let's see what's up. Select here. I think you might be writing SQL in a Python cell. Oh. Is maybe what's happening. So you see the PY in here, that tells me that that's a Python related error and not a SQL related. So try to copy paste that into a SQL cell and I bet it'll run. Yeah.
Yes, though it is very convenient that you can alternate between SQL and Python. If you write SQL in a Python cell, it will get angry and vice versa. So you do have to tell it. It does. It honestly could be smart enough to know it's not that hard. But okay. All right, so I should have something that looks like this. I'm going to rename it campaigns just so I can tell what's different from my other data frame. Okay, I should have something that campaigns, something that looks like this. All right, now I figured out my per campaign spend up here, and I've got my campaign performance data here. So to get my metrics, what we had to do before, right? Join our two data frames. I'm going to need to do that same thing here. Now, this is a little different because here I have 4 rows and here I have more than 10 rows. All right, but I also have this piece of contextual information that this value is the same for everything we run through Facebook ads. Okay, it's the same for everything we run through Facebook ads. So remember when I told you before about joins in SQL? The simplest type of join is a left join. Conceptually, what a left join is it's the data table you want to end up with is the thing on the conceptual left, and then you're adding onto it this way any rows that match. Now, if rows match multiple times, they will add them multiple times. That's what a left join does. And if it's missing a row, it just will add nothing. Okay, so that's what a left join is. Other joins sort of get different with that logic, right? Of like what you do with missed ones or duplicate ones. Okay. For left join, back to here. Basically what left join is going to do if I join on vendor is it's going to say every time I see Facebook ad, I'm going to put this amount in the campaign column. Every time I see influencer marketing, I'm going to put this amount in the campaign column. And in this case, that's exactly what we want, right? So this is a case where I want to do a join, even though my number of rows is different. Make sense? So what type of join you do all depends on sort of the business logic of what you're trying to combine. Okay, so there's many cases where you'll have like a short list and you just want to like add it on to, you could imagine like if this was the first names and you wanted to add everybody's last name on, if their name appeared multiple times in the list, you still want to add their same last name every time, right? That's kind of what we're doing here. Okay. So we're going to write another SQL query here. That's going to get us from this. So we have our UTM campaign, our vendor, website visits, total purchases. That's the one we just did. we're gonna do that, but we want to add our per campaign spend. Okay, so I want to get from this guy that we wrote up here, our per campaign spend that we calculated previously. I want to join that onto our campaigns model that we just made. All right. Now the column that we have in common for this is our vendor. So when I do my join and my using with my column, I want to use my vendor column there. All right. You want to do a join and just remind you what that looks like. Yeah, here's our little join syntax. So typically when you do a join, that's a good time to use a select star because that just means grab all my columns from both my tables, especially if you have two big tables. It's much easier than typing out all the column names. Select star. I know I want to end up with the number of rows that my campaigns table has. So I want to select star from my campaigns model that we just made. And then the thing I want to join on is my model that tells me for each vendor what's my per campaign spend. So whatever you called that model. And I'm going to join that on my vendor because that's my overlapping piece of information. Okay. Anybody get that join to work? Yeah? All right, great. So that join, hopefully this makes sense. Okay, so select star from campaigns, left join. Joined is what I called it before. So my thing with per campaign spend is joined using vendor. Okay. Now I did a little bit of an extra thing right here. Instead of just saying left join, I could have just done this. I said left join joined and then run this. I can do that. That's great. That still gets me my per campaign spend. It also gets me a bunch of other columns that I know I'm about to calculate CPV at my campaign level. And this is joining on my CPV at my vendor level. And that's honestly just like a little confusing for my brain. So I don't necessarily want my vendor level CPV in here when I know I'm about to do campaign level CPV. I'd have to name my column something else. Might get confusing. So all I'm doing is replacing my, instead of just my data frame name, I'm doing like a little baby SQL query inside here. I'm just doing parentheses where I'm just grabbing my two columns that I want. So all I wanted from joined is my vendor and my per campaign spend, even though it has like 5 other columns right here. I don't want those. I just want those two. So just as like a total visual, like aesthetic choice, I'm just doing those 2 columns. And then otherwise my join statement is exactly the same. Makes sense. So I'm doing select star here, but I'm just doing 2 columns from joined, and that's why it's only going to do when I rerun this now with this added back in. So now it's just going to have the 4 columns that this data model had, plus the 1 more, right? Because it's using vendor as the overlap, so it's not going to reprint the vendor column, and then it's just adding this 1 other. Does that make sense? All that. Okay, great. So now I'm here. I just named this campaigns 2. Name it whatever you want. And now we're going to do our same calculations that we just did. So now now that I have my spend and my purchases and my visits in the same table, I can do the same formulas that I just did. So if I want to do CPV, I can add a column that same way I just did in either SQL or Python. I'm going to do my same CPV formula. So if I were you, I would go back and copy paste whatever you did before, paste it into a new cell and just do it on your new campaigns data model instead of on your vendor data model. So copy paste as much as you can. Don't rewrite something you can copy paste. If you're copy pasting it a lot, you should write a Python function, which we touched on briefly last week. For an ad hoc analysis like this, copy paste is totally fine. All right, so all you're doing is you're adding a column to do CPV, which as a reminder is our campaign spend divided by our number of visits. All right, so we're adding a column for our CPV. Right, again, you can do this in Python or SQL. I think I did it here in Python, but either would work. Anybody get CPV added? All right, what you got? Yeah.
Yeah,
Amazing. Beautiful. Okay, great. So I just did campaigns 2. That's my data frame I was using, made my new column called CPV. That's the reason that I didn't include CPV even though in my column up here. So I decided to not include it because I knew I was about to make one down here. All right, and then I'm just referring to the name of my existing column per campaign spend, website visits, and I'm just doing my slash for my division. And then I just put campaigns 2 here again, so it would spit it out so I could see if it worked. Okay, got checked, that looks right. All right, and then I'm gonna do the same thing for ROAS. Okay, so same thing for ROAS. So again, I could copy paste here and just switch my column names, or I could go copy paste the ROAS I did before and just change my data frame name. Either of those would work. All right. Anyone who's writing any amount of code is lazy in like a positive way. All right. You should not retype something that you can copy paste. Please copy paste as much as you can. Reuse stuff. It's the point of technology. Okay. All right. So one more time. Add our ROAS. ROAS is what? ROAS is the total purchases our customers made. So basically our revenue coming in divided by how much we spent to get that revenue. Okay. So that's our total purchases divided by what we spent to get those customers in the door. Okay. All right. So you should see something very similar. So I'm just going to do a ROAS, and then I'm going to divide my total purchase column by my spend column, just like we did before. Very similar. Again, if I was doing this in SQL, I would just do select star, comma, total purchase divided by campaign spent. Do the same thing. Okay. All right. Cool. So now I've got my performance metrics and now I've got more rows, but I want to know what are my top ROAS. Before we found our top ROAS channels were Facebook and podcasts. So now I want to know what are the top ones within that. So I'm going to grab everything from that result and order by ROAS. So that's what I want to know. The default order is going to be smallest to largest. In this case, I just want to get my eyeballs on the largest to smallest. So I'm going to do descending, DESC for descending. I also could have just tacked on, well, yeah, if I had done this step in SQL, I could have just tacked on an order by to my SQL statement, but I did it in a separate cell here to sort by my ROAS. Okay, so here I see this particular Facebook ad, Launch VIP, this campaign had my highest ROAS, that's great. And then second is this podcast. All right, that has almost a $3 ROAS, that's great. And then we see a couple other Facebook ads, a couple other podcasts, and then my Google ads, my influencer marketing. Right now, we'll also notice, we remember from before we had 4 Facebook campaigns. So here we see that 3 of them are in kind of our top ROAS. That probably means our other Facebook campaign didn't do so great, probably a little bit lower down the list. So if my strategy is going to be to keep spending money on Facebook, maybe I just want to do it on these 3 campaigns and not that underperforming one. All right. We're getting close to time, but the last of this here is just to do a little bit of kind of cleaning up your data to summarize, which will next week in the visualization part, we'll kind of talk about how you create a final report, how you use the visualization tools built into Hex, as well as visualization tools in Python to make sort of a final visual report. So we'll do something similar to this. All I did here is I added a nice little display table of my top 6 campaigns, my ones that had a ROAS higher than $2. So I just did a little bit of cleaning. I just said I want to do limit 6. I just want to display my top 6 to my boss. And she's not super technical. She doesn't need all my columns. She just wants, you know, whatever my final columns are. I can come over here and add this to my app builder. Okay, the app view is kind of like the view you're going to share with like your kind of non-technical stakeholder. And then when I come back over here, I have this nice report. I added a little text thing to say, here's my recommendation. And then here's the data that supports it, right? It's embedded right there. This is the final report. It's the kind of thing I could share with her. Okay, we covered a lot of stuff today, but hopefully it helped you reinforce maybe some of the things from week 1, week 2, put them to use a few different times, kind of get some muscle memory of doing a few different types of queries and types of Python. All right. Okay, so just one last note. We've talked about this a couple times, but when should you use SQL? When should you use Python? Everything we just did today could be done in either, right? I think you asked about doing something in Python at one point. I said this is simpler in SQL. You'll start to see that as you try these out. It also just depends which you're more comfortable with, which one you learned first or whatever. But every single thing we did today, you could do in either. And actually, every single thing we did today, you could also do in Excel or Google Sheets. So another good way to learn or debug if you're working in SQL and you get an error, I would just export your data, do it in Google Sheets. If you get data in Hex, you can download it from your little data file thing. Like you could just come here and download a copy of the Excel if you wanted, right? And then do your exact same thing, troubleshoot, figure out your formula, whatever. You can kind of get to what you're trying to get to. And then you can go back to your SQL and try to make it match, or your Python and try to make it match. Okay, so that can be a good debugging tool. So in general, you could do either, or you can do it in Excel. And then kind of as you're learning this, come to here. Once you get to sort of a intermediate level with SQL, I think you'll typically find it's faster than Excel for a lot of like quick analysis. So I like it for that reason. But totally up to you. When you start working with really large data sets, SQL is going to be a better choice than Excel also. So if you're opening up a spreadsheet and it's so large, it's like really slow to run on your computer, or the Google Sheets like really slow to load, something like that. That's a great time to switch to SQL, just upload to a Hex doc and start doing it there. And if you're starting to write SQL that's getting kind of long, or you're trying to do a lot of manipulation, that's a good time to switch to Python. So some of the like, last week we were doing some kind of text analysis, some word analysis. Those are things that would have been like a really long SQL query or a lot of like SQL manipulation. So when you get to there, that can be a good time to switch to Python. Okay. All right, so that's what I got for next week, or for this week. Next week, we're going to kind of wrap this up with some visualization. So there's a bunch of visualization libraries built into Python. We'll touch a little bit on those. So it'll be a little bit more Python practice next week, as well as the built-in tools in here for creating visualizations. These are very similar to Tableau or Google Data Studio or any of these other kind of tools you might have heard of. So anything we talk about tomorrow, or next week rather, will be kind of transferable to those other tools as well. So if those are tools you're interested in learning, the session should be helpful. There's not a ton of great tutorials online that are like this, like what we just talked about, sort of combining SQL and Python, which I think is a bummer because that's what I do every day. But there are some decent tutorials on Hex's own website that have some good stuff. So if you want to kind of like run through similar stuff to what we did, again, they have some pretty good stuff on their website. And that takes us right to time. So thank you guys so much. I'll hang out here if anybody wants to chat, questions, any of that stuff. And otherwise, hope to see you next week for our last one in this series.